Alright, today I'm going to talk to you about why boomers don't get it. But before I do, I just want to remind you that part of the reason that I'm doing these videos is I want to start to really plug my writings. This is one of the books that I've written. I've got a new one coming out soon. The new book, I'll start talking about it soon. But this book, Defending Conscience, How Baptists Reminded the Church to Defy Tyranny. This is part history, part political, part theological, and weaving these things together and showing how Christians should be at the forefront of defending conscience and defending righteous liberty in this world. So let me encourage you to check that book out. But my topic for you today it's a really simple one, and it's one that many of you will relate to. And that is simply this. Boomers don't get it. Or I should say, I don't think many well-off Australians get it. I really don't. And particularly boomers, I don't think they realize just how much the prosperity of this nation has changed in the last 25 years, even the last 20 years. And for some, especially the young, they don't understand how much the prosperity of this nation has changed just in the last 5 years. I want you to look at this graph. I'm going to put this up on the screen for you to have a look at. This is from Macro Business. This is the top countries of birth of buyers in new housing estates. I want you to look at those numbers. 25.8% of new homes bought in new housing estates, 25.8% of new homes bought in new housing estates are bought by people born in Australia. 32.9% by Indians. But if you calculate all this up, I mean, people say that China's buying our country, but it's just not the case. The truth is, people from all over the world are buying this country, and more Australians are being locked out of the housing market. But if you add all these numbers up, this means nearly 3/4, just under 3/4, very close to 3/4 of all new houses being bought in new housing estates are being bought by people who were not born overseas. Now, to put this in context, and many Australians can relate to this, but I know people can relate to this in America, in England, in Europe. This is happening in the middle of a housing crisis. Our current government, we've got an election coming up soon, but our current government has brought in records amount of people. Records amount of people. And this has helped escalate inflation. It's especially helped escalate rent prices and housing prices. And as you can see, just slightly over a quarter of all new homes being bought in new housing suburbs are being bought by people actually born in this country. And when you consider the fact that many people with Australian citizenship are children, people who are born to parents who are born overseas and have moved here, this means less and less heritage Australians are actually being able to afford to live in their own country. Boomers, and many of you well-off Australians, you've got to understand, this is not the country you grew up in. And for the biblically literate, what I want to do is I want to give you a biblical illustration of how this happened before, this loss of prosperity in a rapid time, because I think this might help you understand what is happening. I'm going to take us to the book of Isaiah. Now, Isaiah began his ministries in the days of King Uzziah, who was also a contemporary of Jeroboam II. Uzziah was the king in Judah. Many of you know that Israel and Judah split up. You've got the kingdom of Israel, its capital is in Samaria, and then you've got the kingdom of Judah, its capital is down south, and it's in Jerusalem. Now, in the days of Jeroboam II and Uzziah, Israel reached what some scholars call its silver age, its second peak of prosperity. And under both Uzziah and Jeroboam, Israel reached the kind of prosperity and power and prestige in these two kingdoms that it had in the days of David and Solomon, which was the golden age of Israel. You know, Solomon was the time when Sheba came to see the wealth and the incredible, gold and silver and wisdom and everything that was included in the reign of Solomon's reign of prosperity. But in the days of Uzziah and Jeroboam, Israel had managed to claw their way back up to a similar level of prosperity. And Isaiah began his ministry in the time of Uzziah and saw these nations spiral into decay. Isaiah lived long enough to see Israel, that is the northern kingdom with its capital in Samaria, completely destroyed, and Judah was so defeated by the Assyrian armies which destroyed Israel that Judah became basically a tiny little rump state who lost most of its land, most of its power, most of its wealth, and most of its prestige because of the invading Assyrian armies. Now, Isaiah didn't live to see the destruction of Jerusalem. That's later on. But he did see the destruction of Israel, and he prophesied it, and he saw the almost complete destruction of Judah in his day. And we actually see a description of this in Isaiah chapter 1. Here's an example. Isaiah 1 verse 7. Your country is desolate, our cities are burned with fire. Strangers devour your land in your presence, and it is as desolate as overthrown by strangers. Now the whole of Isaiah chapter 1 is actually set after many of the events which come later on in the book. It's basically like a prelude. You know how in the movies they show you the bad situation people and then they kind of explain how it got there. Isaiah chapter 1 does this, and Isaiah 1 shows us basically what happened to the people of Israel and the people of Judah because they ignored the prophets. Strangers devour your land in your presence. Let me read the whole verse again. Your country is desolate, our cities are burned with fire, strangers devour your land in your presence, and it is desolate as overthrown by strangers. Now, the rapid decline in the days of Isaiah in Israel and Judah are phenomenal. They went from a near record wealth under Uzziah and Jeroboam to having a situation where only the wealthy could own homes. Isaiah 5 verse 8 says this, Woe to those who join house to house, they add field to field, till there is no place where they may dwell. There is no place where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land. That's right. The Bible warned about a situation where only a few people could even afford to buy a home. What had happened is the wealthy were gobbling up land. People are struggling, the economy's breaking, things are going bad, armies are starting to invade from outside. And what did the wealthy do? Well, they used their incredible advantage to start gobbling up that land until there was no room left for anyone to live in the land. Israel reached the stage in its decline where the poor, who had a right, they had a biblical right. I mean that literally in the most literal sense. They had a biblical right, and the kings and priests of Israel had a biblical responsibility to make sure that the poor were able to live affordably in their own land. But they were being locked out of their housing market by the greed of the wealthy. And their land was being given to foreigners to do with as they pleased on top of this. They were losing it all. And I got to say this, while it happened in a much more dramatic day, in Isaiah's day, while it happened in a much more dramatic way in Isaiah's day, they had fierce conquering Assyrian armies as part of the fall of Israel. It was much more dramatic, but still, we are seeing something very similar today in Australia. History doesn't repeat, right? But it does rhyme. Australia has fallen into the same kinds of sins as Israel. I encourage you, read Isaiah 1-3, look at the list of things that Isaiah says were corrupting that nation, and you will see a reflection of our own country in there. And because it fell into the same kinds of sins, it is facing the same kinds of consequences as a result. And explaining what is happening in Australia through this biblical lens might just help baby boomers who tend to have more of an understanding of the Bible and more of a connection to biblical faith. It might actually just help them understand what is actually happening. See, boomers, let me address you directly here. This is not the country you grew up in. Not even close. You know this in your hearts. You know that all the gender nonsense that we see today did not exist in your youth. Well, you know that, don't you? All the gender nonsense that we see today did not exist in your youth. Well, neither did the current state of the housing market that your children and your grandchildren are facing, neither did that exist in your youth either. The advice you give to young people about getting into the housing market is about 40 years out of date. Conditions have changed. You saw Australia at its peak, like Isaiah. Isaiah saw Israel at its peak. You saw Australia at the peak of its prosperity. Maybe you could argue that's in the the early 90s or the late 80s. But you saw Australia at its peak. At the peak of opportunity and the peak of affordability. Yes, many of you worked hard. to get where you are today. We understand this. We're not discounting this, but you've got to understand that the fruit of your hard work was much more prosperous and much easier to come by than the same level of hard work is today for your children and your grandchildren. This is just an economic reality. Young people are working hard. You can look this up. Many economists talk about this. Young people are working hard. They're saving hard. They're not just blowing all their money on avocado toast and lattes, right? Young people are working hard. They're working in a similar level of hardness as you guys worked when you were young. But the fruit of that labor is no longer the same because the economy has completely changed. Yes, young people need to work hard and save to do well, but we also need social change because this country has changed so much. The deck is stacked against young people in a way that it wasn't stacked against you guys. You, as I said before, you saw Australia at the peak of its prosperity in the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, for example, I know some older people, some older boomer age people who've had multiple divorces and yet they still own their home. And they didn't have a degree, they didn't have a high-paying job. What they simply had was an advantage to get into the market in the early 80s, the late 80s, maybe even a little bit sooner, or the early 90s when houses were in the tens of thousands, incredibly cheap. And because of that economic advantage, as house prices have shot up over time, they've been able to wear the cost of even going through one of the most expensive things that people can face, which is not just a divorce, but multiple divorces, and still come out the other side owning their own home. Young people aren't going to have that same advantage, which is a good thing in a sense, because hardship forces people to reflect on their lives. But I'm just pointing out to you, a normal guy working a full-time job as someone who stacks shelves at Woolworths, or just as some basic kind of trade which didn't pay a massive wage, he could save money from the time he was 15, 16, 17 and be in the housing market by the time he was 21 back in the 80s and 90s without much difficulty. And then his wife could stay at home and they could work on their household together. He could provide, she could raise the kids, and this was the norm. Now we don't just have a situation where both the husband and wife need to work. We have a situation sometimes where the husband and wife need to live with their parents of one side or the other just to be able to afford to make rent. I know plenty of young people, younger millennials and older Zoomers who are in this situation. They are married, they have their partner, and yet they're still living with their parents because life is so expensive. Much of what we call progress today is simply judgment on our society for rejecting God. Now, hopefully this has helped you to understand that just as things like gender identity have gone crazy and no longer make complete sense and have caused great confusion in our society, so too has access to reasonably priced housing also gone crazy. All these sorts of things are to be expected in a declining society. The young do need to work hard and say it, of course they do, but they need social change. And this is where I want to address you again, boomers out there. I want to encourage you in this. You have the most economic power because you guys have the most resources, but you also have the most political power. I'd like to encourage you to really start thinking as a generation, how can you use your economic and political power to change things in our society to make things easier for your children and grandchildren. Things need to change, and they need to change really quick. Let me just encourage you again, if you'd like to pick up my writings, this is my first book co-written with Timothy Grant called Defending Conscience. I have a new book coming soon, and I'll let you guys know about that. But for now, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you next time we get on to talk about something else.